Today is going to be the first part in a four-part look at the Civil Rights Movement in the United States' history. Before we even begin, we'll do a quick little review as to maybe addressing the question, why was there even the need for a civil rights movement? Didn't the American Civil War 100 years prior solve the issues of inequality in the United States? So a quick little recap, again, nearly 400 years ago when America was founded, African slaves were being brought over, that by the end of a nearly 200-year period of history, over 500,000 Africans were brought to the United States. After America's independence from Britain, most of the northern states by that point had declared slavery illegal and abolished it, but many of the southern states did not. That would lead from the late 1700s through the first half of the 1800s, an abolition movement, an era to abolish or end slavery throughout the entire country. It would lead to further things such as a Fugitive Slave Act, Missouri Compromise, and ultimately things like the Underground Railroad, in which people are fleeing the South to go into the North, a Dred Scott court case, which identified slaves as property and that therefore they didn't have rights to the courts to hear their cases. And it ultimately boiled into an American Civil War, where by that point in history, 4 million people in the United States were held in bondage. And the question of should slavery be illegal in certain states was taken to the test. Civil War ends in 1865, and then there were passed 3 amendments over the next several years. 13th Amendment said slavery was illegal. 14th Amendment, primarily in its simplest form, says that if you were born in this land, you are therefore identified as a U.S. citizen, and anyone who is then African American is a U.S. citizen. If you're a citizen, you get the full rights of a citizen. So that 15th Amendment says that they have the right to vote, no matter what their color of their skin is. Yet even though they have these newfound rights, that doesn't automatically mean that people's hearts change just because the law has changed. It takes a while for some people to treat others as equals. And throughout the late 1800s through the first half of the 1900s, southern states are going to use their governments, use their power. Some groups will use intimidation to remove and now take away some of those rights that were newly given to African Americans. And so there are going to be those creations of black codes and Jim Crow laws, limiting people's abilities to vote, limiting people's ability to be on a jury in a courtroom, limiting job opportunities, limiting their abilities to travel and move to other cities. And it creates this world of segregation that is going to be symbolized in another Supreme Court case in the late 1800s called Plessy versus Ferguson, where an African American down in New Orleans is told he has to sit in a certain part of the train. He takes it to court, says he bought a ticket. He can sit wherever he chooses in another part of the train. And the court agreed at that time of this phrase that it was legal to have separate but equal facilities should a state choose so. And for nearly 60 plus years, there would be a segregation of schools, of work offices, of buses, and different facilities for people of color in the United States in certain parts of the country. As segregation goes on, people continue to advocate for the rights of African Americans. Organizations like the NAACP are going to be formed. There are different views on how to bring about further equality by people we had mentioned in past chapters like Booker T. Washington, W.E. Du Bois. There's going to be the creation of a Black History Week, and some schools will start to teach a little bit of African American education and history. Many African Americans who are experiencing segregation policies, who are experiencing oppression in the South, are going to start migrating during World War I, during World War II, into northern cities for factory jobs in Detroit, going to California, going to Chicago, going to New York. And in those urban cities of the North, they are going to form their own cultures and communities and bring some of those Southern traditions, like jazz music, into cities like St. Louis, Chicago, Memphis, and into New York City. And slowly by the 20s and 1930s, there is a cultural renaissance that historians have deemed, in which there was a flourishing of African poetry, journalism, music, acting, and writing. By World War II, African Americans are working in U.S. factories. Some of them are getting other opportunities in the U.S. military, and all of these further opportunities to prove that they are just as equal as any other U.S. citizen are being shown. And as they continue to advocate for their rights and to be treated as an equal, it will culminate following World War II into a new phase that we call the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s through 60s. In this class, we'll say that it even goes as far as into the early half of the 1970s. And once again, 1860s, American Civil War ends the issue of slavery. Laws at the time say we're all equal, but people's hearts and individuals are going to resist that and try and find ways to create other forms of inequality. And those forms of segregation and inequality will continue and not fully be dealt with for nearly another 100 years. That now we're in the 1960s, and now a new movement to bring about new changes and reforms in America are going to start to happen under new types of leaders in this movement that we'll be looking at. We've already looked at the 1950s in a prior chapter, how areas such as professional sports, in baseball, in basketball, desegregation is starting to happen. Today, we're going to look at three major events that symbolize the early changes of the civil rights movement in the beginning in the 1950s. Other forms are already starting to take place in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C., that restaurants cannot discriminate or refuse service. Our first major event of what we're going to identify as the first stepping stone in the civil rights movement takes place not in the Deep South, but in the Midwest, in the capital of Kansas, known as Topeka. There is going to be a Supreme Court case that is going to be known as Brown versus Board of Education, and is going to deal with this issue of segregation in public schools. Mr. Brown is one of over 30 parents who are African American living in the city of Topeka, and his daughter has a school nearby, just a few blocks away, but she is not allowed to attend it, that it is a white-only school. Mr. Brown's daughter has to go to the other side of town, let's say 7 miles away, to attend school every day. He thinks that she should have the full right to just go to the nearest school by her and not have to be driven and taken to the other side of town every day. Him, among other families, take it to a lawyer. Mr. Thurgood Marshall and his team are going to obviously argue it to the local court. It's taken to the appellate court, and then it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court and what is known as Brown versus Board of Education. Its significance is that this Supreme Court case is going to be the first piece and little chip at the bigger issue of segregation and inequality in America. Late 1890s, Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal was okay, creating segregation. Brown versus Board of Education is going to say separate but equal schools is not okay. That is illegal and wrong. That having separate facilities does not create equality, that there are inequalities amongst them. So the Supreme Court has now said public schools must be desegregated. They cannot be separate facilities for Asian, Hispanic, Native American, Black, white, and so forth. From this point on, if we now have desegregated public schools, what else in our culture and society can be desegregated? Mr. Thurgood Marshall, after this, will continue to advocate other court cases, and in time, he will become the first African American on the Supreme Court as a justice on the bench. The school, which Mr. Brown wanted his daughter to attend nearby, today is a national park site that highlights these events. So 1954, sometime if you haven't seen it, there is another film that deals with this topic called Remember the Titans with Denzel Washington, where just because the Supreme Court case in 1954 says desegregation must now start, doesn't mean states and local governments are willing to right away make those changes. That examples like William High School in Virginia, another southern state, it will take nearly 2 decades after this court case for them to start to have both white and black students go to the same school. And in this film, Denzel Washington is the football coach and has to handle that situation of bringing people who don't always see eye to eye to bring them together as a team and compete at a very high level for a high school football season. Other changes are continuing to happen in the world of culture and sports and in music. That other athletes, Satchel Paige, Willie Mays, Ernie Banks, things are happening in the world of sports and entertainment. Jackie Robinson and the Dodgers finally win a World Series, but the year after, they will then move out of Brooklyn and go to New York or go to Los Angeles. And so after 1954, Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education says separate schools is wrong. The next year, there's a tragic event that takes place in a small town in the Mississippi Delta. There is a young boy from Chicago named Emmett Till. It's summertime. He's going to go home and see his grandparents down in Mississippi. For whatever reason, it's still a little bit mystery. One day, Emmett goes to the nearby kind of corner drugstore. There is a white woman there, and he whistles at her. 2 white men, one of them the husband of the woman, take offense to this boy's actions, and within that night, he is kidnapped. He is killed and brutally murdered, and his body was horrifically tortured and mangled and ends up in a nearby river. It takes multiple days for police and local authorities to find his body. Eventually, his mother has it put on public display of his body so that the world would see of what horrific things happened to her son. And it becomes another continuing open realization of what is really happening in parts of our society in dealing with race relations. What makes it even more of a tragic story is not only just Emmett being murdered in a horrific and brutal way, you have the court case. Sometime if you still haven't read it, maybe in school, is to look at the book To Kill a Mockingbird or watch the film on it, that this real life story is very similar in that same way, where you have a southern city. It's going to gain national and world attention over what's going to happen to these 2 men who have been charged with the murder of Emmett. It is a white audience, it is a white jury, it is a white judge, and in the end, the 2 men who are accused of the murder, the jury finds them not guilty. They are acquitted of any wrongdoings and are let go. And it is a huge shock to the American public and to the world in this era again of a Cold War, where America is supposed to show the best to the world of what democracy is, and these kinds of injustices are occurring. Maybe a little jab at it as well is that town of Sumner, Mississippi, a sign of that time.